is one of the smart folks to make this all happen. And that happens to be Janice Brummett. Janice is currently the president or chair of the board of the Dogwood Foundation. And Janice was there early on, and Janice continues to be there with the Dogwood Foundation for support of broadband. Janice, thanks for joining us, and I'll ask you for a comment or two.
Good morning, everyone. And it is my honor to join all of you today on behalf of the Dogwood Health Trust, both the board and the staff. And I want to thank all of the team who has brought us together today because, with the blinding flash of the obvious, COVID has made us aware of our need for expansion of both affordable, accessible, and reliable broadband and throughout our region. So today, as we hear from federal, state, and local experts about how to create a plan for that accessible broadband, I want to make sure that we can help create a plan that creates broadband for school children, for educators, for businesses, for healthcare, and for everyday citizens. So again, on behalf of Dogwood, who has created one of our platforms around broadband accessibility, I am excited to be here, and Dogwood is glad to help in this effort. So thank you for allowing us to be part of this.
Thank you, Janice. And I should mention everybody should eat at Arby's once in a while. Is that right?
Yes, please. Yes,
my wife and I do that occasionally, so we try and help out. Another person that's been involved really from day one, the organization has been, and that's UNC Asheville. We started with Mary Grant being involved. Ann Ponder was involved in this thing, but Nancy Cable has really ratcheted up UNC's involvement in broadband. And Nancy, we're delighted to have you join us and be one of the co-sponsors of the session today. And we'd appreciate a kind welcome from you. Nancy? Nancy, I don't know whether this is the problem with others, but I'm not getting a very strong signal from you at all. Let's jump in here from Kelly Brown, chancellor at Western Carolina University, and we'll come back to Nancy. Hopefully we'll get that technology resolved. Kelly?
Dr. Cedarberg, we are working on getting her in now. She's having problems.
If you get a flavor of this, we all work for Sarah Nichols. And one thing I've discovered over the past year is that as long as we just do whatever Sarah Nichols, and I must have add to that Russ Harris, we'll be all fine to go. So are we ready to try Nancy again?
Okay, should we try more time, Bill?
There we go. Nancy Cable brought you from somewhere, and Nancy, we're glad. Hopefully it'll connect better. Go ahead.
You are so honored to this.
Nancy, that is just not coming across to me. I think we have a good case of why we need better broadband at hotels and stuff. Can we, Sarah, can we get your permission to switch to Kelly?
I haven't seen Dr. Brown come in yet. She's still struggling. Do we have Nate Denny?
I'm here.
We do.
All right, let's go and have a greetings from Nate Denny. Nate, you have more time because of the technology issues that we have. Nate, we're delighted to have you join us. If you don't know Nate Denny, Nate, I think of Nate as the $2 billion man. With all this money coming into the state of North Carolina from federal and state sources, Nate is the Deputy Secretary for Broadband and Digital Equity with the North Carolina Department of Information Technology. And he is busy building the staff and creating the programs that have been funded. And Nate, we're just delighted to have you join us, and appreciate it. Welcome. And then a brief comment, if you will, about the plans in the office and the expenditure of these dollars. And I teased Nate that I thought this would be a good opportunity for him to announce that all of the money was coming to Western North Carolina. I think he's going to not do that, but he did tell me that if he looks a little tired, he's got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old child at home. He's delighted to get back to the office work. So Nate, we're delighted to have you join us.
Thank you so much, Bill. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Yeah, Bill asked me in the planning for this event if I had any hobbies. And I was like, I don't remember hobbies. I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. Those are my hobbies. Look, thank you, everybody, for inviting us at the Department of Information Technology and in the Cooper administration to speak to you a little bit about building digital equity across North Carolina. I'd particularly like to say, on behalf of Governor Cooper, who couldn't make it this morning, thank you for all of your leadership and your work in communities across Western North Carolina. You know, we joke about the huge amount, the influx of federal and state dollars being directed to broadband infrastructure access, deployment, building digital literacy across North Carolina, but the real work is happening at the local level, and we appreciate all of you. You'll hear a lot more from Angie Bailey, the director of the Broadband Infrastructure Office at DIT, and from her deputy director, George Collier, soon. They're the real experts. They're the ones you really want to hear. But I just want to say, first, thanks to them, we're building an incredible team at DIT to help execute on this mission. And they're doing a whole lot of work ramping up and getting ready to start putting money in the ground and out the door on behalf of the people of North Carolina. As they'll probably discuss a little bit more, Governor Cooper has a clear vision for building digital equity and closing the digital divide in North Carolina. As this group's heard from me and Angie in the past, Governor Cooper and the North Carolina General Assembly directed more than $1 billion to addressing infrastructure access, affordability, and digital literacy across North Carolina. And we've got some pretty clear, aggressive goals to hit. We want 98% of North Carolinians to have access to a high-speed internet connection by 2025. We want 80% of North Carolinians subscribing to high-speed internet. And when I say high-speed internet, I don't just mean 25.3, right? Because that's not sufficient for the needs we have today to fully participate in the modern economy. Our minimum for investment will be 120 speeds, scalable up to 100 megabits per second, download, 100 upload, symmetrical high-speed internet in across North Carolina. I mentioned that 80% subscription rate. It's important to note that's not just a statewide average. We want to hit that rate within demographic groups across North Carolina. Not every community in North Carolina is recovering from the pandemic and its economic consequences at the same rate. And so we want to make sure we're making targeted investments that make sure everyone realizes the benefits of these taxpayer projects. We want, I think right now in North Carolina, white households subscribe at a rate of about 76%. Black, Latino, and Native American households lag considerably behind that. And so we want to make sure everyone's hitting that 80% marker. And then I think most importantly of all, we want a 100% subscription rate for households with school children across North Carolina. We want to permanently get rid of the homework gap here and make sure that all North Carolina students have access to the tools they need. To do all that, we are having to scale up our operation considerably. Angie leads a team of about 10 people that really worked miracles to get about 15 million a year out the door over the last 4 years, and now they've got $1 billion to spend. We've started off by launching our GREAT Grant program, which is an incentive program for last mile providers to invest in rural parts of the state. Applications for that $350 million pot of funds are due to us from internet providers on May 4th. And then we hope to have awards out a month or two after that. We will also be launching our new Completing Access to Broadband program that I think I've talked to this group about before, a $400 million matching program by which we would work directly with counties that have received American Rescue Plan funds and identify unserved or underserved areas, work with those counties to build RFPs and go directly to the market. It's a much more strategic, flexible approach than the GREAT Grant program. And then we're also building a new Office of Digital Equity and Literacy that will work on the affordability challenge of the high cost of high-speed internet, help get low-income North Carolinians more devices, and help build training opportunities and fund training opportunities at the local level to build digital literacy, including important principles like privacy and cybersecurity that more North Carolinians need a solid understanding of if they're going to engage in the economy through high-speed internet. And we're doing all this using American Rescue Plan funds and getting ready for President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure bill, which will send a really tremendous amount of additional resources to North Carolina, both for digital equity programming and for last mile access. So as we do all that, we need your help, right, locally. We want to be partners with you. As I said at the outset, we can't execute if we don't have folks in communities across North Carolina working to address this challenge. That's you. So you've got a lot of work to do too. And we really need your partnership on raising awareness of the Affordable Connectivity Program so that more North Carolinians can take advantage of that $30 a month discount on high-speed internet service, creating new digital literacy training or device opportunities, and planning for all these infrastructure funds so that we can build smarter fiber deployment or fixed wireless or satellite deployment projects across the state of North Carolina. So we really need your help. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll make sure my email address is in the chat here. Don't hesitate, especially to reach out to Angie and George. I hope they will also put their email addresses in the chat. If they don't, I will. So thank you all for your time and your work and for giving us a brief opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Nate. And I'll twist your arm a little bit. Don't forget Buncombe County's proposal. It's in the works somewhere. And we have Brownie Newman and a great delegation here from Buncombe County. So do you feel lobbied there a little bit?
Well, I appreciate it. How could I ever forget Buncombe County? We know that a lot of work has already happened there, as in many other counties across the state. We appreciate the commission's leadership and foresight there. And so look forward to working with Buncombe and other counties across North Carolina on these CAB projects to get better service.
Great. Well, thank you for spending some time with us. And we're going to be hearing from Angie here in a minute. I understand that Kelly Brown is now online from Western Carolina University. And Kelly's been a big supporter of our broadband initiative over the years. Kelly, are you able to join us?
I am. Thank you, Bill, and thank you and welcome everybody. I'll just take just a second here. I appreciate, Bill, the opportunity to continue this ongoing conversation around broadband in Western North Carolina. Since arriving at Western about 2.5 years ago, I've heard nothing but the importance of broadband for Western North Carolina. The lack of access that we've had out here for high-speed internet really hinders the economic development and the quality of life in the region. I see some of my partners here in Jackson County that are here with the school and others, and it really does make a difference. Broadband is the 21st century equivalent to electricity, and we need it in Western North Carolina. So I'm proud to say that Western has leveraged our assets, our poles, our electric poles, to be able to provide broadband to Cullowhee Valley, and we'll continue to do that. And I'm very, very excited about that. We want to continue to advocate for this basic infrastructure that we hope will help for sustainable economic prosperity in Western North Carolina. Western Carolina University is the regional comprehensive out here in North Carolina, and we stand ready to partner with the Western North Carolina Broadband Project in any way, in every way that we can. And we'll help the governor reach those goals that he has and being able for sure access for broadband at those levels. This won't be the first time that we've been working with our community and making a difference, and we'll continue to do this. So I'm very hopeful for our future. I look forward to working together and being able to make high-speed broadband internet accessible for the region. And thank you very much for including myself, and look forward to working with everyone and today's Broadband Summit.
Kelly, do you think it's safe to assume that the technology at Western Carolina University is stronger than the technology at UNC Asheville, since the Chancellor Cable had a hard time signing on? So is that a fair conclusion, do you think?
No, I don't think that's a fair conclusion.
You're very diplomatic, very
I
diplomatic.
don't think that's a fair conclusion at all. I think UNC system is pretty strong. So.
All righty. Let's move on. We have a number of dignitaries I would like to recognize that are on the program today or attending and watching us. Senator Julie Mayfield has joined us from the Asheville area. Representative Jake Johnson from Polk County, who's been a really strong leader in the legislature on this issue for this region. The new state rep from Asheville, Kayla Brudow, is online. And we have a number of other legislators from throughout the region that have joined us this morning as well. I mentioned Brownie Newman, who was with us from day one and has been a very strong leader in Buncombe County. We have County Commissioners Amanda Edwards has joined us. We have Terry Wells, who's been an incredible power. Terry, I see your photo on the screen. She's been an incredible power to advocate for broadband in more rural areas of the region. And we appreciate her leadership. Jasmine Beach Ferraro is online, another county commissioner who's a strong advocate. We have Robin Ramsey online, who represents Senator Burr's office and has done a nice job in steering some of those federal dollars. Jordan Barnes from Senator Tillis's office has joined us, and those congressional offices have been very, very helpful to overall project. And I could go on, but Sarah Nichols told me I couldn't. And so if you weren't singled out, it's all Sarah's fault. So I'd like to blame her, but we do need to move right along. As Sarah correctly pointed out, people are really here to get some information about broadband and to get up to date on what's happening. So I'm going to turn the program over to Greg Vogt now. Greg is a retired attorney. Well, I guess he's not totally retired, but he's an attorney living in Black Mountain. Greg was with the FCC for a number of years. He has been an incredible resource for information about broadband policy issues as we've worked on that. So I'm going to now ask Greg to lead the conversation with our two special guests today. And I'll turn it over to you, Greg.
Thanks very much, Bill. I really appreciate it. The first guest that we have this morning is Paul Desaw, who's a partner with Quadra Partners in Washington. He's been part of the federal government for quite a while in a number of administrations and has been very close to the broadband situation. Welcome again, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. Thank you all for having me.
I just wanted to kick this off. I appreciate you joining us again this year. So what has happened in broadband in the last year since you talked to this group last year?
Well, I think the main thing that's happened, and Nate referred to this, is the enormous amount of funding that has both started to flow and will be coming over the next year on a bipartisan basis, because the nation has finally recognized that broadband is critical, universal deployment and adoption, both critical. And this is really, once in a generation opportunity to solve the nation's broadband problem once and for all.
Well, thank you. How successful do you think that government is going to be in achieving 100% coverage of the unserved with broadband?
So there are a number of programs that are coming down the pipeline, both on the deployment and the adoption side. Many of them run by the Department of Commerce through the NTIA, some of them through the FCC, but much of the money, and this is something that's very different from historical broadband policy, is, as many of you know, much of the money is coming from the federal government to the states, and the states will have to administer then the distribution of the money. And that's very different from what's historically happened, where generally the Federal Communication Commission has handed the money directly to providers to build out broadband. So this is very different. approach to solving the broadband problem. And the pro of it is hopefully there will be much more local coordination. So in much of the legislation, it explicitly talks about states working very closely with localities and intra-state organizations to make sure the money is going to solve the problems that communities really face and the way that communities want to solve them. The con of the approach a little bit is, and this may not be as true for North Carolina, but for many states, they don't have the capabilities really at this point to distribute billions of dollars for deployment and adoption. And so building those capabilities and tackling the management problem is going to be huge. So to answer your question, I mean, there's certainly enough funding to solve both the deployment and the adoption problem. There's no doubt about it. The question, I think, is whether the states will be able to do the sort of efficient and effective allocation of the funding in order to solve the problem and reach universality. And I'll just give you one sort of very, very sort of simple example. If you imagine a case where, let's say, there's an area that doesn't have broadband, and that's maybe because the cost of deploying broadband would be, just to simplify, $100, and the revenue from the project would be $80, and therefore it doesn't make sense to deploy because the revenue is less than the cost. The answer there would be a subsidy of $20, right, to make it break even. So the revenue of $80 plus the $20 subsidy would be break even with the cost. What I fear is going to happen sometimes is that the subsidy will be more aligned with the cost. So the states will say, hey, it costs $100, here's a $100 subsidy. And that's probably 5 times as much as is actually needed. And if those sort of allocations, more cost-based allocations prevail, then there won't be enough money to reach universality and the problem will not be solved.
Well, you point out that the program's kind of interesting. The NTIA's new program, where they have about $42.5 billion to hand out to states who are going to turn around and then provide money to providers pursuant to an application process. It's kind of an interesting 2-step process that we haven't seen before. NTIA has said that it's going to establish the rules of the road here in the May timeframe. What kind of guardrails do you think that NTIA is going to establish for the states to follow?
So you're exactly right. So the biggest deployment side program is the so-called BEAD program, the broadband deployment funding that NTIA is managing of $42.5 billion. And that is going to the states by formula. So it's essentially based on the proportion of unserved locations by state as a fraction of the national total, which will be determined by the maps that we'll probably talk about later. So North Carolina will probably get, we won't know till the maps come out, but $700 or $800 million of incremental funding from NTIA through that program. And obviously NTIA has to strike a balance between the objective of the legislation, which is, as I mentioned before, to give the states the flexibility to spend the money in ways that make sense for the specific state and the specific locations and communities within the state, but also trying to put some guardrails around, as you mentioned, Greg, in terms of trying to make sure there's enough consistency and lessons are being learned across states, and that states that maybe don't have as much capability are getting the assistance they need. And so so either May or June, so they've said in the second quarter of this year, NTIA will put out a notice of the funding opportunity, the NOFO, which will contain their sort of guidelines for approving the money to allocate to the states. And I think there will be quite a lot of guidelines there in terms of enacting the legislation at one level more detail. So in particular, the pertinent things are, if you're taking money, people who take money have to have a low cost option, and NTIA gets to define or approve. The states get to volunteer what a low cost option would be, but NTIA has to approve it. And so that will obviously make a huge difference to the affordability and adoption once all this money's been spent for deployment. There are other guide rails around probably the technology. So as Nate mentioned, the Bill 2 standard in the legislation, meaning if I get funding, I have to build a network with at least 100 megabits down, 20 megabits up capabilities. But that still leaves quite a lot of technological choice between fixed wireless and different kinds of fixed wireline broadband fiber. And so trying to decide how much weighting to give to better technologies or more future-proof technologies is another thing that NTIA will probably put some guardrails around. And then there are other things in the legislation. The build-out has to occur within 4 years. It has to prioritize, historically, structurally poorer communities, and so on and so forth. So that sort of step of bridging between the real hard implementation work that the states have to do to actually start writing checks and the relatively high level guidance in the legislation, that's where the NTIA will be putting the guardrails. But as I say, they'll put those out in the next few weeks, and so we'll get a good sense of what they look like.
So how much flexibility do you think states are going to have to be different from each other in this process?
I think they'll end up with quite a lot of flexibility, and the flexibility will be around important policy decisions like how do you choose, or what balance do you want to choose between funding incumbents who might be able to deploy quicker and who know how to build broadband versus funding sort of new entrants who might be able to use more efficient technologies, who might bring competition to the market, who might have other benefits. And that's sort of a policy tilt, I think, which will vary a lot state by state. Technologies, as I mentioned, probably fiber and fixed wireless, as well as other things like satellite, will all meet the legislative requirements, but obviously they have different costs to deploy, and I think states will tilt in how they allocate, they choose to allocate. I think NTIA probably would prefer more fiber rather than less, because that will be future-proofed, and then we won't be here in 10 years from now talking about another round of hundreds of billions of dollars to upgrade networks. But I think states will be able to choose that. So on those kind of dimensions, I think states will end up having quite a lot of flexibility. And again, that I think is the intent of the legislation, that there will be some variety and experimentation among states. And hopefully that will give the states also an opportunity via NTIA to learn from each other, sort of as over the next few years the money gets spent and projects get started, then hopefully there'll be, I think, a lot of best practice sharing, and NTIA is certainly keen to make that happen so states can, both customize for their own needs, but also learn from each other as the money's being allocated.
So you mentioned the 10-pound gorilla in the room, broadband mapping, which has been very controversial for a while. The FCC's tasked with this, and we're now into a year and 4 months since they actually got the money to do it. When do you think the maps are actually going to be out and be able to be used, like in the NTIA process?
Mm-hmm. So the Chairwoman Rosenworcel has committed, and I think the FCC will meet this, to put out the map, at least a good first cut of the maps in fall of this year. And I think they will meet that, and then there will obviously be lots of subsequent refinements, because there is a whole challenge process. And again, this is a real job for the localities and the states to check those FCC maps and to challenge where necessary, so that the FCC can refine the maps going forward. But I think we will see the first round in fall of this year, as the chairwoman has said. I'll just observe there are two very important uses for the maps that are distinct, and you kind of alluded to it, Greg, in your question, and they shouldn't be confused. So the first is using the maps to allocate the $42.5 billion of BEAD money, right? So as I mentioned, that money is allocated across the states, mostly in proportion to the number of unserved locations by state. So if North Carolina has 100 unserved locations out of the nation's 100,000 unserved locations, North Carolina would get 10% of the money. There's some complications with respect to high cost areas and so on and so forth, but roughly speaking, it's pro rata based on the unserved locations, and the maps will decide the unserved locations. So that doesn't have to really be super precise. NTIA will have to make a decision when the maps are good enough to do that rough allocation process. So that's one use, which is very important. And it's very important. Why it's important that the states get it right is because that could swing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars between states, depending on how many unserved locations the FCC thinks are in each state and when NTIA draws the line to start the allocation process. That's one. The second use of the maps, though, is actually cutting the checks and funding locations to get broadband built. And there it's obviously very important to have the locations absolutely precise, because those are the projects that are going to get funded by the states. And that's a little bit more of the state responsibility to work with the FCC maps to come up with those locations. And then at the state level, people can challenge to say whether there's locations are already served or already being funded or not being funded. So those are two. One is for the allocation. Maps don't have to be super precise. Really, the FCC and the NTIA deciding when to draw the line on the map. And then the second, which will play out over a much longer time, is literally as the states write the checks to fund projects, which are the specific locations that are in or out. And so, over the next, I think 18 months, mapping is going to continue to be the problem will get solved, but it will continue to be kind of controversial and in the news, and to some extent a bottleneck on some of the funding.
And I only have a couple more minutes now, but I did want to hear your view. Aside from the availability of funding from the government, what role do you think mobile, satellite are going to play in the broadband arena?
So to some extent, all this funding is coming at a very interesting time, because we are seeing very different technological developments on both satellite and fixed wireless. So satellite, for me, I would say it's almost certainly the case that there will be at least two credible low Earth orbit so-called satellite options available to pretty much every location in the country, meeting the 120 requirement. So there'll be at least sort of the Starlink offering, which is currently commercially available in most places. That's a SpaceX offering. And then there's several other constellations that are going up, including one by Amazon, the Kuiper constellation. So you can absolutely imagine in 5 years that you could get 120 broadband for $10 extra on Prime. Amazon Prime will include satellite broadband service. Totally possible, I would say. So, aside from subsidies, you'll have at least two satellite options. And again, aside from pricing, those are additional options in the market that are much better than historical satellite options. And then you see also the particularly the mobile carriers and national mobile carriers, as well as WISPs, offering fixed wireless, which again is increasingly meets people's needs, will meet the 120 benchmark. And so you'll have a lot, I think, of those options. And because it's being done by the national carriers or by WISPs who've been subsidized, they have different cost structures and therefore can extend that deployment out to currently unserved areas, even aside from subsidies. So, I think we're at an interesting point, because there's going to be a lot of subsidized broadband, probably tilting more towards fiber. And then you're going to have just the secular new entrant technologies of satellite, low Earth orbit satellite, and fixed wireless, which I think, again, they sort of reinforce each other to hopefully increase broadband deployment and availability throughout the country.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And for the group's participants, Paul has agreed to be in the breakout group for federal policy, and we can get into these discussions in a lot more detail than we had now, because I know that 15 minutes isn't much time to get into that. But I'd like to move on and introduce Angie Seifer, who is the head of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Welcome, Angie. I saw your picture up there somewhere.
Hi, Greg. I'm here. Thanks for having me.
No, that's great. Angie, could you tell us a little bit more? I have to tell you, I was not familiar with your organization, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about what your role is in this field.
Yeah, sure. We got started about 7 years ago because there wasn't an entity representing digital inclusion programs on the ground. So we represent folks that are organizations, community-based organizations, libraries, housing authorities, local governments, who are the ones that are helping teach folks how to use the internet, helping them get connected to a low cost or subsidized broadband service, helping them get a device. And these efforts have been ongoing around the US in a grassroots kind of way. There hasn't been money, right? This new 2.75 billion that we have is historic, right? The money has always been kind of a local scramble to figure out how to pay for these types of activities. That's what's changing. And so NDIA saw a need before this federal money for folks to share best practices, peer-to-peer kind of networking, but also we learn from what's happening on the ground and educate policymakers as we did, resulting in that 2.75 billion for digital equity. One of the ways we've been able to do this actually is by Amy Huffman, who used to work for the New York Broadband Office, is now a member of my team. And so her expertise from North Carolina, that's a big part of how NDIA helps folks around the country, is that you all have been leading the field, leading states in this work, and the rest of the country very much appreciates that.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate your participation here because it's one that we hadn't talked about enough last year. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on at the FCC with digital inclusion efforts? I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but just like where they've got to.
Right. The most important thing that we've seen from the FCC is the Affordable Connectivity Program. So before we had Lifeline as a phone subsidy, and then it was expanded to include broadband, but it was still only $9.25. So what can you buy for $9.25? Now that we have it, so temporarily it was $50 a month for broadband support, and now it's $30 a month for eligible households. That's a significant support for someone's broadband bill. So the FCC is running that program now. They also have the the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which is schools and libraries can utilize that for home broadband. So it used to be the FCC limited their activities to connectivity through anchor institutions, right? Schools, libraries. But then they were also helping with the rural deployment. But now there's this added piece from the FCC where it is a significant help with that connectivity in the home.
Thank you. Recently, Senator Cantwell at a broadband hearing up on the Senate side said that she believed that broadband inclusion or availability was more of a problem than actually deploying networks. What do you think about her opinion in that regard?
I think all the barriers are important, right? So we need to look at every barrier. There's the barrier to the physical infrastructure. That's more of a rural issue, right? We do see it sometimes in urban areas that they don't have the availability of a fast enough network. But the bigger issue that we see, no matter where one lives, is affordability, whether it's rural, urban, suburban, tribal, that it's internet service in the home is expensive. So that affordability piece is something we have to figure out, which we have lots of potential ideas and we're lots of real solutions right now, but I don't know that we're at a full solution to that yet. But then also there's a digital literacy, as Nate noted earlier, which North Carolina is, clearly trying to address. The digital literacy aspect of it, this is the education of how to use these tools. The part that's a little bit, creates heartburn for lots of folks is that we will always have to figure out digital trainings because the technologies are going to keep changing and we're going to have to keep figuring out how to use the next new thing, and how we as people use them is going to keep changing. So we have to keep providing that tech support and that guidance on how to use these tools. That's a cost that's not going to go away. We will be able to deploy the broadband service itself, hopefully to where it can serve all the households at the speeds they need. But then do folks have the right device, and do they have the digital literacy skills that they need to participate? The device piece will always change. We all know personally, it seems like every time you turn around, there's, you need to get something that's newer and more functional for your needs or not too slow. So I think us all recognizing what all the barriers are and then addressing all the barriers is how we're going to be able to get at some solutions, holistic kind of solutions. If we narrow ourselves too much into just one place, we're going to be sad with the results.
So you've mentioned some of the barriers. Are there other barriers that you want to mention?
Other barriers, I haven't mentioned privacy, security concerns. So folks may choose not to participate because they're worried their credit card is going to get stolen, their identity is going to get stolen, all of which could really happen, right? These concerns are legit. There are ways to lessen those risks. So this is, again, training, education, helping people be safe online in order to be able to participate. Those are educational and social support systems that we don't really have established in the United States. So that's systems level change, right? Systems level change for forever, not for a short-term program.
What about equipment costs?
Equipment costs are a significant barrier. We see in some programs when there's a low cost or a free service and a device that comes along with it, low-income households are more likely to be attracted to that because there is a device and that meets an additional need that they have. For low-income households, it's common to have a mobile phone. That mobile phone may not be a high quality mobile phone. It is most certainly not an iPhone. It is more likely to be an Android, and that mobile phone may be their only device. So imagine needing to talk to your doctor or participate in online classes with only a mobile phone. It's very limiting. There are some folks who feel comfortable doing certain things online and on a mobile phone, and others who don't. Particularly older adults feel more comfortable with a larger screen, bigger buttons, right? So having mobile phone as their only device very much limits their ability to participate. The other important note, I think, is that we used to think of participating online as optional. I hate to be like the bearer of the news. I don't know that it's optional anymore. Not because I'm saying you have to use the internet, but I don't know how you survive. I don't know how you certainly thrive without doing it when so many of our systems are online, right? Other folks, good intentions, always, right? Let's reduce costs. Let's make it easier for people. Let's put things online. And they do, and that's awesome for most of us. But for some of us, they're like, whoa, wait, I just wanted a vaccine shot. And you're telling me I have to go online to get a vaccine shot? Can I just call somebody to get a vaccine shot? No, for a while. The answer was no, you had to do it online. So what
about job applications?
Job applications, yeah. Try getting a job today and being like, can I just drop off my resume? The answer usually is no. Even at a fast food place, right? They're going to be like, here's how you apply. For a while there, I was seeing computers at Target where you could sit here at this computer to submit your application because they were not getting applications because folks couldn't do that from home.
Right. Thank you very much. So NTIA is overseeing about $2.75 billion for state and federal digital equity programs, and the FCC has a proposal in the context of the Affordable Connectivity Program to also put money into outreach efforts. How do you think this money should be spent most wisely?
Most wisely is for the money to go to organizations that are trusted by the communities they serve, right? So if a very flashy, sparkly kind of organization says, we'll help lots of people, but they don't have connections in the local community, chances are their success is going to be a little thin. We need to make sure that that trust is already there. That's harder to build, right? So having the trust, because technology is intimidating. We don't necessarily trust internet service providers. We certainly don't trust the government. So why would you trust these programs? And because technology itself is something that has harmed people, right? We need to make sure we recognize that. Lots of us know folks who have been victims of scams and phishing and all of that. So there are lots of reasons for someone to say, no, not for me. So if we have that trust factor already in the organization that is then providing those digital inclusion services, that's going to be more successful.
So I heard Chair Jessica Rosenworcel, FCC chair, say at a recent House Oversight Committee that this is what they've learned, that you need to get trusted local organizations to tout the program so that they can increase usage. Who is a trusted local source? I mean, you know how much people trust the government these days.
That's exactly right, which is why we all need to be super careful.
Sorry, everybody from government who's out there, but I'm just telling you the truth.
I'm sure all the government people on this call are totally awesome and trustworthy. It's those other government people, right? It's the organizations who are culturally aware and have have folks on staff who are from the communities that they're serving. So it's not just they should know the language, by the way, if it's not English, whatever that language, that dominant language in that neighborhood, but it's also cultural issues, right? To make sure that the examples that are provided and the outreach is reaching people where they are. Good example, there was an effort trying to figure out if healthcare and a digital literacy program could find a way to work together. So the clinicians in the health center, when they came across someone who didn't have internet at home and needed digital literacy training, would give the phone number of a digital literacy training program that could also help them with getting internet at home and a device. Folks didn't call the phone number. So that digital inclusion program moved into the clinic and had a location there. And then people were participating in the program because the program came to them rather than expecting them to go to the program. So those kinds of strategies where we are more attentive to the needs and the realities. Plus, folks are busy, right? If we're not available, if we're scheduling classes while they're at work, that's not going to really help anyone. So making sure that we're meeting their exact needs.
And the other proceeding I wanted to mention at the FCC is they've just recently opened an inquiry proceeding, is the way they call it, on digital discrimination. The older word has been redlining. Right. Do you think that there's a problem with digital discrimination, and how do we see it today?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this, and I love that it's a conversation that's being had at the FCC and in lots of other arenas, because we just haven't addressed that in the United States. And in this particular, so digital discrimination, one could define lots of big ways, but in this particular context, Congress said to the FCC, figure out digital discrimination, what we could possibly do about it. So in that context, it's about broadband service providers. So are broadband service providers discriminating, whether intentionally or the end result, it may be unintentional, but the end result is discriminatory. Is that happening? And if so, how do we fix it? Digital redlining is one piece of digital discrimination. So digital discrimination is much broader. Digital discrimination may be how an internet service provider markets their services. Are they marketing them in one way to higher income households and marketing them in a way that's more difficult to access to lower income households? That would be not intentionally discriminatory, but the end result is that you're getting more people signing up from a higher income household than a lower income household. So that's the kind of, we need to dig into that. Is it happening? How is it happening? Are faster technologies being rolled out in higher income neighborhoods? Yes, I can tell you definitively yes. And the reason for that isn't because internet service providers are all, I was going to use a negative word, not very good people. But it's because their end goal is the profit margin. And that profit in a short time span, which as a capitalist society, we're like, well, that's how things work. But for those of us who care about everybody having access in our communities and recognizing the negative impact on the whole community when some folks don't have access, that's something we as a community want to fix. And so that means working with that internet service provider to come up with a solution. And if they're not doing it voluntarily, then might regulation need to come into play? Yes, I think that's where, if we can't figure out those voluntary solutions, we then have to figure out solutions that additionally address that problem.
Okay, so I'm seeing Sarah looking, the time is running out. And so we should probably wrap this up. There is a digital inclusion breakout session after this, which will be a place to explore some of these questions in great depth. I noticed we got some questions in the chat, but we should hold those for the breakout session.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Greg. And one of my team members will be in that breakout. So I'm thrilled you all are doing this. It's a fabulous event.
And I very much appreciate your time this morning, Angie.
Thanks. Thanks, Greg.
Mm-hmm.
I think I will jump in and we'll start the next session. Thank you, Greg, for those conversations. And I think the breakout groups will be quite helpful as we move ahead. We now have probably the part of the program that many of you are anxious to observe and to learn from. And that is Angie Bailey, who's director of the North Carolina Department of Information Technology Bio Office, the Broadband Infrastructure Office. And George Collier will make a presentation on the state budget and the state funding opportunities that we have. So Angie, I will turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And I believe that you all are gonna, y'all are gonna run the slides, which is super. Well, first, I just wanted to thank Bill and the Western North Carolina Broadband Group and Land to Sky, especially Sarah Nichols, and Southwest Commission. You all, Western North Carolina has really had such a focus on broadband for the past 20 years that I've been in this space. And it really, it's just, you know, as Nate Denny said, Nate is my boss, this work is really done at the local level. And there's so much going on right now that we really need folks engaged, and we need leadership at the local level, helping us sort through all this giant opportunity that we have as a state. So thank you for that, and for convening all these folks today. So I'm Angie Bailey. I'm director of the Broadband Infrastructure Office at NCDIT. So we are part of the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. Next, and I call this a broadband update because, to be honest, there's so much information floating around. We're trying to share information on a regular basis. So you may have heard some of this, but I think we just have to kind of have continual dialogue on what's going on to keep folks up to date and for us to get feedback from you all. So next slide, please. So as mentioned, so the Broadband Infrastructure Office that I oversee has been around since 2015 in DIT. Last summer, we did create the division within our agency to kind of, you know, with the expectation that all this ARPA funding was coming down the pike. And we also created the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy, as Nate mentioned, to make sure that, you know, as Angie Seifer mentioned, Amy Huffman, who's now at NDIA, was part of our bio team. And we, you know, we've always had a focus on digital inclusion and recognize the importance of that work. But now that, again, with so much going on, we wanted to make sure that there's an intentional focus on digital equity. And so that's why our sister Office of Digital Equity and Literacy was created. So that makes up our division. I think Nate already covered kind of our metrics and our goals that we have. Next slide, please. And so again, you know, as we've kind of discussed in this session so far, you know, we obviously have a big focus on broadband infrastructure. You know, I do believe, you know, kind of one of the questions that was just touched on is, you know, what are the causes? How do we solve these problems? I mean, infrastructure really can be solved by funding. It really is a return on investment issue. And so we do have this funding now. So that's exciting. The data, we have to have good data to figure out where these investments can be made. That is an ongoing issue that people around the country are working on. Enabling more North Carolinians to afford high-speed internet affordability is a huge challenge and a huge piece of the puzzle. We don't have subsidy funding in North Carolina beyond the federal Affordable Connectivity Program. And so that's something we're very focused on pushing and sharing information about. And then increasing digital literacy, as Angela touched on in the last session. Next slide, please. So, I'm sorry, one more. So as we've kind of talked about, and you all hopefully are already familiar with these pots of funding in our November state budget. Well, last March, the federal government passed the American Rescue Plan Act, March of last year. Our state budget was passed in November. And so it appropriated this $1 billion in American Rescue Plan Act dollars to run through our division for infrastructure, 971 million and 941 million in federal money for infrastructure programs. And I need to take this poll so I can move this off my screen. So our Great Grant program, as Nate mentioned, that's $350 million in federal state fiscal recovery fund money. That was launched in January, and folks are working on their applications right now. the Completing Access to Broadband program, I'll touch on a bit more. There's also 90 million for Stopgap Solutions, 100 million for a pole replacement fund, and $1 million for broadband mapping. And so that's all going on. We also have 50 million for awareness and digital literacy that's coming through our Office of Digital Equity and Literacy. Those programs are still being developed. And then we have some administrative funding. Again, this is all ARPA money. This is before we get to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding. So next slide. I'm sorry, and one more. And so, as mentioned, our Great Grant program, I won't go into a lot of details, but it is, makes up almost a third of our infrastructure funding. That program was launched in the end of January of this year. Applications are due in 2 weeks, so May 4th. So the exciting thing is by midnight on May 4th, 2 weeks from today, we'll actually have one less unknown. We have lots of unknowns going on. We really don't know how many applications we're going to get. We've gotten literally hundreds of questions. We've got a giant guidance document on our website. We've posted a lot of FAQs with some updates that we posted last week as well. So there's lots going on with that program. There's a lot of legislation around GREAT. It is a state program that we launched in 2018. So I think there's been some discussion around capacity and the capacity of states to manage all this money. I mean, we are fortunate in North Carolina that we have had a broadband office. Really, we've had some type of state broadband office for the past 20 years. So it's trying to take that capacity that we have and build onto it to be able to, make the best use of this opportunity. So if you're interested in GREAT and the details, George Collier, who is our deputy director, will be doing a funding session breakout this afternoon. There's also all this information is available on our website. And again, those applications are due May 4th, and we'll have a better idea of what kind of volume is coming in. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to touch on kind of two pieces of GREAT that have been a bit different this round. The partnership language in the Great Grant program was updated for this ARPA round. And so, there's a large focus in our legislation with the intent that we really wanted to get counties involved in these projects because the Great Grant program, the eligible applicants are broadband service providers. But there is some partnership language that asks, that allows for counties to be involved in either providing matching funding or in providing infrastructure towards a project. And so this is what's on the screen is kind of what's in our legislation that applicants need to provide as part of the application for proposed partnerships. So it has to be in writing, it has to provide specific terms and conditions, it has to be signed and attested by the parties. And so what's always been a bit complex about the partnerships are that, we're asking for a partnership before we have an actual award. And so we did publish a fair amount of clarifications in our FAQs last week about partnerships, and just to stress that, we do recognize that these will be proposed partnerships coming in with applications because we don't have the award, and then once the awards are made, once we do all the scoring and applications are reviewed, we do the scoring, awards are made, then we will have to go back to counties and ask for kind of final partnership agreements based on the funding that's actually been awarded. So I just kind of wanted to stress that. I know our counties have spent a lot of time trying to sort this out. And so we really appreciate you digging into all this with us. And we hope that you all will check the FAQs from last week. All right, next slide. The other piece that I wanted to mention besides partnership specifically is protest. So this is the other thing that we're kind of preparing, besides preparing for as we review the applications, how to review all the proposed partnerships is really how do we, there's a protest process tied to our legislation. And so all the applications will be posted online for a period of 20 days. That's the legislative requirement. And then applications can be protested but specifically and only on the criteria that an area included in the proposal is already served. And that application has to come from a broadband, it can only come from a broadband service provider that is claiming that they already serve that location. And these are done, the great grant applications do come in at the location level. Talked a bit about mapping. So providers have to say exactly which locations they'll be serving or they're proposing to serve, and protests have to be at the location level as well. So again, and one change with the protest process is that a project area that contains 10% or more total households with access to broadband can be protested. So in other words, if less than 10% of the households are thought to be served, that's not enough for a protest, because we were getting some protests for just, 3 or 4 houses. And so that's why I believe this 10% was added. So we're kind of ramping up for this process, and you can anticipate these applications being online shortly after we receive them. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'm looking at STAGs. I don't have my chat open, but since we're on this, so the state's likely to receive several hundred projects. How long will it take the state to administer the challenge project, score due diligence, and announce funded projects? That's, to be honest, what we are working through. I don't have an exact timeline. I know people want an exact timeline. At the moment, to be honest, we're trying to decide how much to vet the applications before we post them for protest. And we're also, the legislation requires they be posted for 20 days. They could be posted for longer. I think we will stick with the 20 days, but we will do as much as we can to keep people posted on the timeline. But we're working as quickly as we can. So that's great. Excuse me. That's the great program. The CAB program will come up. Will come up after we have a sense of the grade awards, but we are working on it already. So what we expect is that the CAB program, the general rules for CAB, should be released next month. And so probably what we will do is release the actual rules of the program and then come out and work with individual counties on the actual bidding process. So CAB is a partnership between each county that wants to participate and DIT. And instead of a grant program, it's a competitive bidding process. And so what's a bit different, it is to serve unserved households and businesses. But what's different is GREAT has a very prescriptive scoring criteria that's in the legislation. So CAB, we will have to develop the evaluation criteria. And so that's what's unique and what's exciting about CAB to me. Obviously, the criteria has to match up with our state legislation and with the federal rules around this funding. But that is kind of a big difference than with the GREAT program. The other thing that's different is that legislation requires that we mutually identify eligible areas with the participating counties. And so I think what you'll see is our mapping for CAB will be very different. We will still provide the foundational layers, but what we'll need to work out with the counties is how we can share information that needs to be added into the mix. The third thing that's very different is that the CAB legislation talks about unserved households, which is less than 25.3, same as GREAT, but it also talks about underserved areas. And so there's not a clear definition in legislation of what unserved areas means. The federal legislation around this funding talks about serving areas that have less than 100 down, 20 up. And so that's what we're trying to sort through with CAB is what are the eligible speeds. So I think so obviously that's really important. So no county can receive more than $4 million in funding from the CAB fund, which is the state portion of the funding. Counties would actually put in funding, state puts in funding, and that's how, and the selected bidder has to put in a match. So that's a bit different as well. And then the state provides the program and fiscal oversight of the projects. So again, that's in process. And we hope to have the rules published, the first kind of set of rules published on that next month. Next slide, please. And so just to stress again, mapping is obviously a huge part of any of these infrastructure investment programs. If you've not been to our state NC1 map site, which is our GIS resource for the state, there is a broadband section. And so right now, some of the key mapping tools that we have up are the Great Grant Online Mapping Tool, which grant applicants are required to submit their applications using that tool. We also have the broadband project planning maps, which kind of outlines different layers that are, should be considered and looking at what areas are served or unserved. And then the NC Broadband Survey, which is our survey and speed test tool that was designed by the NC States Friday Institute for us. And so that's been really important. It's been out for a couple of years, but it's still really important that we get in that information to show it shows individual households and businesses that are unserved. So there's a survey, but also a speed test. And when folks take the speed test, even, if someone has 1 meg down, we would really love them to take the speed test so we can capture that. And there's also a specific question that asks if that's the fastest speed available. And so we'd love to capture that as well. So we really want people to keep pushing out that survey. The data can be downloaded directly from our website or from NC1 Map. And so all these pieces will continue to be important. And again, as we get more into CAB, we'll create more of a kind of CAB mapping tool, and we'll be working with counties directly on what else can be added to that. Okay, next slide. Sorry, I think I'm running out of time, so I just have a few more slides. Our Stopgap Solutions, that's the $90 million, which is essentially to fill in the gaps not filled by GRATE and CAB. And so the legislation is very short. It kind of talks about provision of installation, the provision and installation of infrastructure to expand service to unserved and underserved households in the state. We are using capital project fund money to fund these projects. My guess is that we will start with some type of line extension program. And so that's something we've talked about in the state for years. We didn't have the funding. Some other states are developing line extension programs, and essentially, if we built out GRATE, we built out CAB, and we still have these 3 houses at the end of the street that don't have service. How can we get to them? How can those providers that are closest nearby to them or others, but build out to make sure that we're not leaving out any individual homes. So that's coming. We are in the process of, we do have a Stopgap Solutions position posted. We have a CAB Infrastructure Solutions lead that's joining our team in the next couple of weeks. We have a mapping person we hope will be joining in the next couple of weeks. And we have 2 new positions at Office of Digital Equity and Literacy that have been filled. I don't think they've been announced, but so we are getting in some really good, really important folks to help us with all this work. All right, next slide, please. So again, that's all the ARPA money. Quickly, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This is the funding that's been allocated. Most of the broadband funding will run through the NTIA, as it's already been discussed. And it also is funding some of the Affordable Connectivity Program. And so I won't spend a lot of time on this. I know we touched on this a fair amount in the previous session. But just to say that money, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program called BEAD, that notice of funding opportunities is expected to be released from the NTIA on May 15th or by May 15th. And so again, we expect that funding to come through our division. My understanding of how it will work is that there'll be a state broadband plan that's required to be completed in the first year of the program. And kind of simultaneous to that, the FCC will be working on their maps. That data for the new FCC program is due to FCC on September 1st from broadband service providers. So then we'll have to see when it actually gets released. And then that's the data that will be used, as was discussed, to determine the final formulas for how much funding will come to the state. So this will be coming. Again, we don't know the exact rules. There was discussion around different technology types, and so we're curious to see what all that will look like. There will also be a digital equity program rolling out, also through NTIA with a similar timeline. And that also will require, I believe, a statewide digital equity plan. And so that's something we will be working on. And as we dig into that work, that's something we're really going to need everyone in the regions and the counties to be working with us on, to make sure that as we develop these plans, we capture what's happened with ARPA and what's really needed moving forward. So we look forward to working with you all as that all rolls out. Next slide, please. Okay, we can go one more. So I just wanted to kind of share again, we know that mapping is a huge piece of all of this. We have our basic data that's important. The Form 477 data it's not granular, but it does provide a lot of important information as to what providers are in what blocks. We have to look at what awards are already out there, whether it's Great Grant, whether it's other federal awards. We need to continue to look at RDOF and what's happening with our wired RDOF builds. As we've discussed in other sessions, but the satellite RDOF awards, we consider those areas still to be unserved in North Carolina based on our legislation, our definition of broadband service being terrestrial. So these are all, I just wanted to kind of show this to say this is something we will continue to dig into and work on with you all. And next slide. And again, these are some data that's available in our North Carolina broadband indices. So if you want to check this out on our website, it is dated from a few years ago. It's mostly American Community Survey data. So it's looking at both infrastructure and adoption type of metrics. And so again, this is something that we will need to figure out as this BEAD money comes through, and we're working on state broadband plans and digital equity plans. What type of data needs to be refreshed, what type of data is important, what could be changed. And so I think that our indices will be important, but it's just a start. So we look forward to digging into all of this. Next slide. And then, so how you can help, there's room for partnership in lots of ways in all of this work. So we encourage you all to continue working with your COGS, with your Western North Carolina broadband team, and with us. We really encourage people to continue to push out the NC Broadband Survey, which is on our website, ncbroadband.gov/survey. There's also a phone number that people can call if they don't have internet access to participate in the survey. We ask people to continue to share information about the Affordable Connectivity Program. And then just please stay tuned, because there is so much information. And if you have feedback for us, even on how to share information in a better way, or if you want to speak to a certain regional group, or whatever would be helpful, we would love to hear from you. And next slide. And so these are some, I see this data is incorrect data from the FCC. So we know that the FCC data is overstated. And so that's the challenge, right? Is we have the new FCC data coming out. We don't know exactly when. We will be working on our own mapping processes. And so how can we improve that, both for the CAB program and for the state broadband plan that's coming up? But so to reach out to us, if we ask if you have Great Grant specific questions, we know that's closing in 2 weeks, but please email greatgrant@nc.gov. We're really trying to keep that traffic in one central place. CAB program, if you could please email cabprogram@nc.gov. And again, we're trying to keep our questions around CAB in a centralized place. And mapping questions, if you could send them to broadbandmapping@nc.gov. And we really appreciate you working with us on all of this. And this is just the start. So thank you for having us today.
Thank you, Angie. This is phenomenal, and you guys are doing a great job. And ignore those other comments about not trusting governmental officials. I was a state senator for a while, and I basically trust you guys. And so basically, yeah, you don't know for sure. But we have two other co-hosts that I hadn't introduced before. One was Nathan Ramsey, and the other was Russ Harris, who head up the local regional planning councils. And I hope, Angie, in your planning that you think about the funding for collaborative efforts among the counties, because I think that's an important element. We've asked Nathan to lead the conversation about what's happened in the region at the local level. And Nathan, I think you told me that you're going to be on the beach sunbathing or something. So I hope the technology works for you and you don't get sunburned. So Nathan.
Thank you so much, Bill, and I appreciate everyone who's joined today's meeting. When Bill throws a party, people show up. So we appreciate the leadership of WNC Broadband and so many others that are making today's event possible. We're a little behind schedule, so we'll try to move it along. If you have, I know we have a lot of questions in the chat, try to present those to your breakout room. And you can also reach out to Sarah Nichols or myself, and we'll try to get those to the right individual. It's sarah@landofsky.org or nathan@landofsky.org. It's my distinct honor to introduce Russ Harris, Executive Director of the Southwestern Commission. We appreciate all the many partnerships that Land of Sky has with the Southwestern Commission. Many people don't recognize that they're 2 hours west of Asheville in North Carolina. And we have great collaboration with the team at Southwestern, and Russ and his team do a great job. I also want to introduce Sarah Nichols. I know Dr. Cedarberg acknowledged Sarah earlier. Sarah is the one that makes all the trains run on time. She is truly the Renaissance person at Land of Sky, and we couldn't do this without her. She's been invaluable. So certainly want to appreciate her and our ECD team, and Erica Anderson, that's the director of our economic community development team. So I'll turn it over to Russ and Sarah.
Thank you, Nathan. And I'm just going to share my screen real quick. And of course, it never goes that simple when you're live as it does when you practice. So let me pull that up. Not showing up for some reason. So while I'm pulling that up, I'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to do a regional update for both our regions, which covers 11 Western counties. So Land of Sky is Buncombe, Madison, Henderson, and Transylvania. The Southwestern Commission is Cherokee, Clay, Graham, Haywood, Jackson, Macon, and Swain counties, as well as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And we're going to talk a little bit just what we've been able to accomplish in the past and then what we're working on now. And, you know, we'll go into maybe a little more detail with things you've heard both from the Broadband Infrastructure Office with great grants, talk about what we've done in the region with them. Also talking a little bit about digital inclusion, which we've heard some about, and they're going to hear more about from Maggie Woods going forward in this program today. And I think even before some of the success we've had over the last couple of years, there was a lot of planning that went into it and a lot of things that, you know, people don't see behind the scenes. And I give a lot of credit to the leadership of the region. My predecessor, Sarah Thompson here at the Southwestern Commission, that's with Dogwood now, the leadership of Land of Sky, that even before there was funding really available for broadband, we began doing some planning around it so that we'd be ready when funding did come. So first, we started doing surveys in the region to figure out, you know, make sure we were accurately identifying what the problem was, and also doing some asset inventories to make sure we really knew what the opportunities were and where we could build out and have some success going forward. As funding became available, we started to see success, and we've seen some from some of the federal sources like USDA, Appalachian Regional Commission. They've been great partners, and we've had a couple of projects from those sources. But I think the most movement we've seen over the last couple of years is really from the Great Grant and our partnership with our, you know, with our state partners, Angie and George and Nate and their team. So you can see, starting in 2018, I remember we were so excited with $10 million was available statewide to expand broadband. And when it went to 15 and then 32, we kind of thought we had died and gone to heaven. So to put that into perspective, as we're looking at $350 million now, we really are excited about the opportunity to start to have really expanded progress. In those past rounds, we've had 11 projects in the 11 county region. Those served approximately 5,200 households that were unserved going into those grants. They brought in almost $10 million in grant funding and leveraged almost $8 million in private investment by those internet service providers. All right. And I am not moving forward now. Okay, there we go. So this map shows kind of where awards have been in the region. And so this is counties that have received great grants in the past. Haywood County is not lit up on this map, but they did receive a great grant in the 2020 supplemental round. So you can see that I think 9 out of the 11 counties in our 2 regions have received great grants. This shows counties that have received funding, not necessarily how much funding or how many projects they received. So Graham County and Swain County both have had 2 projects each within those counties. So we've had a fair amount of success in the past. And, and now we're kind of focused on the current cycle with great. So as I said, and as Angie said before, $350 million are available. These grants are due on May 4th. Projects can be up to $8 million per county. And right now, from what we can tell, and I know Sarah Nichols works with a lot of providers, we work with a lot of internet service providers providing support. And we anticipate approximately 23 grants for the 11 county region, 10 out of the Southwestern Commission region, 13 out of Land to Sky, that we're pretty excited about the opportunity and what those grants could mean for our region. And a lot of our support for those companies is grant support, interpreting the legislation, kind of being a go-between for the state broadband office, helping them with maps, any of that kind of support. And, as I mentioned, we get excited about the opportunity, but we also know, there's a fair amount of challenges involved when we look at the map. The map on this screen, kind of lights up and shows, any area that's pink is eligible for grant funding. And I'm not going to go into the live map right now. I was planning on it, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. But when we start to take areas out of this map, if you look in Swain County, there around the Fontana Lake area, there's a huge pink swath up there that looks like a great area to go after broadband. Well, that is all public land and there's nobody living in that area. So when we start to dig into where people live, there's less areas eligible. If we dig in deeper, we look at where previous great grants were, which we can't go into this time around. So that starts to knock out some areas. And then, as was mentioned earlier, with the RDOF grants that were awarded in the fall of 2020, and we're still waiting to see how those shake out, those knock out a lot of areas. Anybody that's set to be served by those grants is not eligible for great grants right now. So we spend a lot of time with providers trying to develop projects and where we can really have more bang for our buck. And, as we look at maps, we kind of use a lot of different tools. We go back and forth between the NC1 broadband map. We look at asset maps, things like that, trying to help providers. And so I'm going to hand it off to Sarah Nichols now to talk about some of the tools she's developing that, we're kind of trying to put all that in one place to make that information easier for people to have access to.
Thanks, Russ. So as has been mentioned a few times on this forum already, data and mapping, you guys said it in the polling, the FCC is looking at it, the state's looking at it, and here locally, we are also looking at it, because this is what my screen looks like probably 50% of the time at this point. We've been very blessed to have groups want to partner with us and provide different tools. It has showed a variety of different stories to tell, and they all do different things. The only maps we can really modify are the ones we create ourselves at this point. And we do have Land to Sky and Southwest both have great mapping capabilities, but we want to take this to the next level and integrate a lot of the data that we're accumulating over here. So we started this using FCC data, and then we took it to a next level, gathering information locally, citizen reported data, found out we couldn't really use that except for some of our own internal planning projects. We had to validate it some other way. So we partnered with the state on their survey. You can kind of see some of that down the bottom left. Buncombe County had a really creative project with NEMAC that kind of created a reverse API. I have fixed wireless tools. I have Ookla data. And my computer always overheats. It's very hot with all of these maps all the time. So I saw a value in kind of a one-stop shop for when we get data, we can deploy it to the providers, we can help communities better scope what's going to need to be done and match it with potential funding sources to streamline shovel-ready projects. So ARC and Dogwood Health Trust have funded a broadband planning tool. It started as a tower propagation product and was pre-pandemic. So during that process, we kind of changed some of our methodology to be broader. So at the time we thought fixed wireless had a lot of viability. We still think that. We also think that the funding is going to favor wireline technologies, and we didn't want to ignore that in the process. So we put out an RFP just recently. Those responses are in. We were blessed with a number of opportunities, and they're currently getting scored with a team. Hopefully we'll have an answer soon. Next slide. When we started working in the planning phases for broadband, so West Engine started with a 6-city initiative and an RFP. The next phase of it was some data digging. We created a lot of maps, we created community profiles. And what was interesting for us then is that we had identified very early on that the region had 2 very distinct issues when it came to digital inclusion. One of those was the infrastructure issue, which we were already working on and trying to address. The other was affordability, and actually per capita, affordability affected more people's ability to connect to their services than the rural issues did. So being that we work a lot in infrastructure, we walk down that path, we work with providers, we know we have limitations in this space as government. And at some point we decided to kind of expand on the greater breadth and depth of the issue. We participated in the Institute of Emerging Issues tech cohort, and then subsequently applied for a Band NC grant that put our digital inclusion plan to work. We finished that up this fall, and we're very proud of it. And we believe that it is the first digital inclusion plan potentially in the country. And that helps us be very nimble and flexible. So when we see a new opportunity or a new need in our community, we will be able to add it very quickly and easily. Following Land to Sky's digital inclusion plan, IEI was awarded through Dogwood Health Trust $2 million to do digital inclusion plans for all of the West. So if this goes as planned, Western North Carolina will be the first in digital inclusion. Now, being as I'm a planner, I'm going to point out a lot of times when you plan, you don't necessarily know where you're going. IEI thought of that, and they secured implementation funds alongside this plan. So in the case of Land to Sky, we are ready to start doing that implementation of our plans. For the other counties who are participating in this program, they will have upcoming sessions to start the planning process. Once their plan is done, they'll have access to the implementation funds. Next slide. So what does implementation look like in this space? Part of our process has been this asset mapping, which as we've added more projects, we keep filling in the gaps. We use the asset map to tell us both where we have geographic gaps, but also gaps in types of programming. So how far would somebody have to travel to do this certain activity? We're following our plan. Infrastructure is still at the top of that list. We very much see infrastructure as a digital inclusion activity. We don't separate it. We'd like to develop competition models. So that would address some of the affordability issues, public Wi-Fi devices, which is something Angela brought up earlier as a significant barrier. I call this chicken and egg. You know, if you don't have the skills, then why do you need the device? And if you don't have the internet, why do you need the device? So we're trying to cluster this ecosystem of challenges and take bites out of it where I can with local leadership. Next slide. What was great about this particular plan is it started getting implemented almost before we could get it finalized. We partnered with the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources and Dogwood Health Trust on some projects just in the last 6 months that included several downtown Wi-Fi projects, a number of public Wi-Fi at community centers, parks, different types of equipment, hotspot lending, and affordability programs. So this is one of these that just by creating some of the momentum of doing the planning process, we built a network of people who are doing the work with their organizations, that local leadership, and we're able to move quickly on implementing these projects. Next slide. So in addition, I don't need to go into some of what we've done in these programs, but I do want to highlight the diversity of funders that can help with this kind of work if it's interesting to you or your organization. ARC has been great to work with in some of these projects. We did a hotspot and laptop lending program with IMLS funds for Buncombe County. Dogwood and ARC partnered on a rural telehealth project that would affect over 300 people potentially. WNC has ongoing announcements, I think twice a year for smaller projects. And ARPA will have opportunities coming through the state, and counties could also choose to participate in some of these activities with that funding if they choose as well. Next slide.
So going forward for both organizations, you know, I think our focus will be somewhat similar, and it's these 3 areas. It's connecting unserved areas. I mean, it's even with all this money, when we're sitting here 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we're still going to have pockets of unserved population in our region. And the picture on the left of this screen kind of highlights that. This is from Macon County, and you've got a pretty good cluster of homes there that are surrounded by projects that have been funded either through federal sources or state sources that for some reason got missed, whether it was the geography of the area or whatever it was. But if we're going to get to the goal that Nate mentioned earlier of 98% having access in the state, we will stay focused on where are these pockets and who is still unserved in our regions. We will continue to build regional capacity, and I think convenings like this have been so instrumental in doing that really for the last 6-7 years. You hear the conversations that are going on now compared to like the first broadband summits we all sat in back in 2015, 2016. It really has elevated the conversation in both our regions and really given us a depth of partner throughout the region that really helps move the ball forward. And I know in our region, we work a lot with the broadband committees who are instrumental in really, we talk about the boots on the ground and who are trusted people in their communities. And for us, that is, the broadband committees. I think I've seen Deborah Porto from Haywood County on this call, who's instrumental in moving projects forward in that county. So we'll continue to support those committees because they really, we get a little closer to the ground, and then we really rely on them to be the one that are in the communities helping to move things forward. And then, as Sarah mentioned, just closing the digital divide, the digital inclusion planning, and that goal again that was mentioned earlier of an 80% subscription rate across the state. And the things that that people aren't able to do to keep up in our society right now because they don't either have the access or the skills to take advantage of that. And another one to add to the list, and Angie Seifer had earlier, is financial aid forms. Are all online at this point in time. So if you're a low-income student looking to go to college and you're looking to get financial aid, well, you've got to have good internet access at home to be able to have access to that. So it's just another thing to add to that list. As Sarah mentioned, we're getting ready to kick off our effort here in the West, and we'll put those links in the chat so that anybody that's in our region or anybody from anywhere wants to attend some of those kickoff events on May 16th and 17th will be able to attend. Sarah, anything you want to add as far as the future focus of both regions?
No, thank you for that. Keeping us on track, we'll move into the panel to our next session. led by Maggie Woods from the Institute of Emerging Issues, one of the, I'd say, brilliant brainstorms of IEI to bring all this digital inclusion across the state. Nationally, she is respected and she has done the data dig on, really being able to address this issue for us. We're exceedingly grateful for her and her leadership in this space. And I will turn it over to her to introduce her panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so excited to be here today with all of you. And I think one of the themes I'm hearing today is some of the challenges of data, but some of the opportunities that data can really leverage to find local solutions. And that's really what we're going to be focused on in this panel. So it was really great seeing that regional overview, and now we're going to pull back just a little bit. We don't have a lot of time and we have an amazing group of panelists. So I think we're just going to jump in. The way this is going to work is after they've introduced themselves, I'm just going to pose 2 different questions to the panel and they're each going to respond to those questions. And then I'm hoping we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, put it in the chat right away and we'll work on getting it. So let's just begin with our panelists. I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves really rapidly. So if you could tell us your name, who you represent and where you're calling in from, that would be great. And Aaron, let's start with you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Aaron Schill. I'm the Director of Programs and Research at National Digital Inclusion Alliance. You heard from Angela Seifer, our Executive Director, a little earlier, and I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon. Good to see y'all.
And just a little pitch, Aaron and I are going to be facilitating the digital inclusion breakout session. So we can continue to answer your questions there as well. All right, Roberto.
Hello, everybody. I'm Roberto Gallardo. I'm the director of the Purdue Center for Regional Development. We're all about regions, obviously. And we have been doing some work on the digital inclusion space for a little bit here as well. So I am delighted to be here. Thank you, Maggie, for the invite.
Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Shelton. I work for the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, kind of alongside Angie Bailey and George Collier's group. I work for a small group called the Center for Geographic Information Analysis and handle all the broadband mapping for them.
Thanks, Ben. And Curtis.
Thank you. Curtis Hansen. I'm with the Appalachian Regional Commission, calling in from DC.
Wonderful. Well, we're happy to have all 4 of you here today. And let's just start at the beginning. So we know that there are issues and challenges with some of the broadband and the digital inclusion data that's available. So what are some of the biggest challenges you're seeing? And as a result of this, what are some of the biggest information gaps? And Roberto, I think we're going to get started with you.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of issues going on here with data. One of the ones that one of the issues that I see the most is the notion that digital inclusion is only infrastructure, and it is not. I have had to spend a lot of time educating folks that it is not only about infrastructure, and so that takes a considerable amount of time, and that is also, I think it pairs with the lack of digital inclusion data per se that clearly distinguishes it from the infrastructure piece. So I think that is one of the issues that we have. On the other hand, of course, we know the FCC data set, right? We all know about it. And this is the analogy I use all the time, is that we know it's inaccurate. We just released a report here that found that it overshot rural Indiana by about 38% on the 25.3 metric. So I don't use it for planning purposes. I use it to jumpstart conversations, heated conversations. So what the analogy I use is I won't use that data to go to Mars, but I would definitely use it to jumpstart a conversation about going to Mars. And there's better data coming down the way, but I think that that's something that's national, and it's the only thing we have thus far.
Great. Thanks, Roberta. I like that. You would use it to maybe plan to go to Mars, but not go to Mars. And it definitely does create some heated conversations. Ben, what do you think the biggest challenges to data is right now?
Yeah, I think to build kind of what Roberta was talking about is, we're getting there on the availability side and getting access to the homes. But the data is really kind of hard to discover and hard to access for those adoption pieces. So as we get more granular availability data at a household level, we also need to know more about the adoption and device adoption, pieces like that, and where the funding is going at that local level to see how that impacts those different communities, to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all the people that are being served.
And that really pairs really well with what Roberto said, is it's not just the access, it's not just the infrastructure, but it's these other pieces, and how do we get better data for that? Curtis, what are the challenges that you're working on at ARC?
Yeah, so we're also, concerned about availability reporting, but the other half of broadband access is affordability. And one of our priorities is to try to promote subscription to the federal affordability programs. I think they were mentioned earlier today. There's the Lifeline program that's $9 a month, and there's Affordable Connectivity program that's $30 a month. Right now, if you want to find out how well a community is doing on gaining access to that funding, you only have access at the county level. You also don't have any information about eligibility, and you also don't have any information, at least in terms of participation, about which providers are seeing the most subscription to these programs. This means that we can't build a scorecard right now to understand how things are working well and how they're working poorly, so that we can promote the sharing of ideas. So until we get that data, we're really leaning on local leaders to tell us what's working and what's not working.
And when he says local leaders, he means all of you who are on this call. We're relying on all of you to help provide some of that information that's lacking from these data sets. And Aaron, you're looking at this from a national perspective at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. What are the big challenges that you're seeing in terms of data?
So in terms of challenges, we've heard a number of warnings today about the FCC data, and we all know that's problematic and kind of overshoots or definitely overshoots availability and adoption. A lot of us use ACS data regularly, American Community Survey, to understand households that do and don't have computers, or that have different types of internet access. So I think one of the big challenges, I don't want to warn people off of using those. We use those every day to look at both a national scale and to help our members and folks we work with at a local level. But I think it's important to recognize that lacking better data, we're using kind of what's available. So we're using data that wasn't necessarily collected for the purposes that we want to use it for. So it's really important to understand what those constraints are and what you should and shouldn't do with the data. So ACS data, for example, is great if you want to compare generally how well one county or census tract is doing compared to another. But if you want to know exactly how many people do or don't have a computer or have internet, it's not great. A lot of you all in particularly rural counties know that in a census tract, the margin of error can be larger than the people in the tract. So if you're trying to get a count of how many people actually need access or a computer, it's not great for that. And so just kind of understanding what that data is intended to do and what the constraints on that data are is really important. And then to call out a gap, probably the biggest gap we see in terms of data around digital inclusion is that there is no real standardized measure to understand digital skills, particularly verifiable information comparing someone's digital skills to how comfortable or how they perceive their digital skills. And that's a huge gap. We know that people need help with that. We know we need to understand where those folks are, and there really is, that's a big blind spot in terms of data to inform that.
Yeah, Aaron, I think one thing that you said that struck me is that this data can be a tool, but it's not always collected for the purposes that we need. And that's an important distinction. And that goes back to Roberto's point of using this to guide conversation, but may not be the be all end all. I just want to note that Deb Watts in the chat did mention that Rural LISC has a map that shows EBB uptick, so the emergency broadband benefit uptick versus eligibility at the zip code level. It is a pretty extraordinary map. And can certainly encourage all of you to do that Google search right now and see what you can pull up. But the purpose of this panel is not just to talk about those challenges, and we can talk about those challenges in a 3-hour event all day, every day. But what we want to do is talk about how we can leverage the data that we do have or that we can collect for solutions. And so I want to know, how can we use locally led data to help support larger initiatives at a state or federal level? Locally led. So again, looking at all the leaders in the room here. And Aaron, since we had you go last this time, I'm going to have you get us started on this.
Sure. So we've heard the term asset mapping a couple of times, and I know that that's part of some of the local plans that folks are putting together. I think it's really hard to overstate how valuable that exercise and that information can be. At NDIA, when we talk about asset mapping, we tend to not talk about the infrastructure side. That is important. Sounds like y'all have that pretty covered, and folks are doing great work on that. But when we talk about asset mapping, we're really focused on mapping the organizations and programs in a community that either currently are doing digital inclusion work or that have the capacity to take on that work and do that work. So that's really beneficial for a couple of reasons. First, it kind of changes, it flips the conversation. So a lot of the data that we think about, like unserved individuals and households, folks that don't have a computer, we're talking about kind of a deficit approach. So we're kind of looking at whether it's older adults or low income households, they're a problem to be solved for, right? There's something wrong with them that they don't have a computer or internet, and we're trying to solve for a problem. Asset mapping kind of flips that and looks at how do we leverage the assets in a community and grow solutions out of the community. And how do we do that by building on the resources that are in that community? So it's a good way, you do need that information. You need to understand where the need exists, but it's a good way to match that with kind of an asset-based approach that's looking at where the strengths in the community are. The other thing that does is, so I mentioned, ACS data, for example, is not great at telling you exactly how many people have a need. The folks that are really good at telling you that are people at the local level. So a senior program is going to be able to tell you exactly how many of the people they work with need help with building digital skills. Or your public housing agency is going to be able to tell you exactly how many of their households aren't served. So that's the way, not only do you build capacity in the community, but you also can get to those populations and get to that more granular data by leveraging those assets.
That's a really great point. And asset mapping is something that we teach in our WNC digital inclusion workshops. Many of you on this call may have participated in the Land of Sky asset mapping as part of the kickoff event for the digital inclusion plan last year. And if you're interested in getting involved in local asset mapping, your regional council will be launching a digital inclusion planning effort, and we'll be doing an asset map. And so I highly encourage you to connect to them. Let's move on to Ben. I know that your office is doing some really interesting things, collecting some local led data. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, from a state perspective, the locally led data sources that we get is through our North Carolina Broadband Survey that Angie mentioned during her presentation. It really gives us a lot of valuable feedback. It allows the community to get involved in the process, shows that they have a voice in this process. And as the FCC starts to get into their new data collection methods at a household level, serviceable location fabric type deal, all of that data is really going to inform us and allow us to kind of validate what the FCC is reporting. So it kind of is a feedback loop that allows us to take that locally collected data and use it in the decision-making process and making sure that the data is correct that's coming in from the federal level. And it's also been extremely valuable to us in a lot of our different kind of focus efforts. We had some migrant housing connectivity working groups. We've had a student connectivity working group, remote learning working group that has put together these dashboards, all of which are available on NC1 Map. I'll do a shameless plug real quick. And so all of those efforts are informed by those survey data so that we know that where students are located, for example, in relation to broadband assets that we have mapped out in community anchor institutions, things like that. All of those surveys and that local data really provides a lot more context than we would ever get just looking at things at a state level.
Great, thank you, Ben. And I know that migrant housing map has been really useful to many of our ag partners. And so appreciate your work on that. Curtis, what locally led data is ARC thinking about?
Yeah, so I'm going to double underline what Ben just brought up, because not every state has built mechanisms for local communities to provide that kind of feedback. So if you haven't taken the survey yourself, I'd encourage you to. If you don't have goals for how to get your community to provide their feedback via those mechanisms, I'd encourage you to, because we spend a lot of time and energy complaining about the FCC's maps. And they preempted that by offering in their new maps address level capabilities and feedback loops. So we need to take advantage of those opportunities to create maps that are accurate. And then something else that ARC is doing right now is working to understand what tools would be most useful for local communities as they're working to prepare for all these different opportunities. So we built a survey trying to, again, gain those insights. I'm going to drop that in the chat. If you could take a few minutes today to give us that feedback, it'll help us know how to best help you.
Again, something that we need from all of you on the call is that feedback loop. And that was a great point, Curtis, and Ben, about the broadband survey. One thing I'll note is out of some of these digital inclusion planning efforts that we're seeing across the state, people are prioritizing getting the word out about the broadband survey, either as a part of their planning efforts or as part of their implementation. So this helps us have more accurate maps. Roberto, I know that you're doing all sorts of interesting data, locally led work. So tell us about them.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, like my fellow panelists have mentioned, local data is very, very important when you want to get to the meat of stuff. We've developed what we call individual digital capital survey. This was inspired as part of the community capital framework. And it's, unfortunately, Europe is ahead of us in this respect. There's a lot of research going on in Europe around this concept itself. So we developed a survey instrument that we deployed in multiple communities across the country. And we find it very, very interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one is because it is local data, it is their data. People pay a lot more attention than looking at census tracts and margin of errors, right? They know it is their data. So they kind of pay a little bit more attention to what's going on. It also provides some ownership and buy-in because we rely on the local folks to distribute the survey, to gather it. It's not done in a scientific way. It's not a scientific sample. It's a convenient sample, but it is for planning purposes, which is very, very enlightening. And then the third reason is that we can now clearly document what we already knew in a way or form, is that there are distinct differences between groups in a community. Even if it's a rural small community, you see different impacts of technology use and benefits and things. We ask about devices, how much you interact online with other community anchor institutions. A couple of them came back and said, I would, but they don't have an online presence. So then we shift gears and we talk to the community anchor institutions to get them online or update their 1998 website situation. So it is very, very fascinating to see that now we can actually see these differences and put a dollar amount many times as to which groups are benefiting most, and the others, why aren't they, and what can be done about it. So.
Great. And I highly recommend that you check out the work that Roberto is doing at Purdue. And Roberto, if you have any links to share, please drop them in the chat so folks can get involved. We have about 9 minutes for Q&A. We thought that was really important. And so I would just say, maybe Sarah, if people are raising their hands, if you could let us know. You're also welcome to type in the chat. I do have a kickoff question for the group. One of the themes I just heard from all of you is we need to hear from local leaders. We need to hear from you. And you did mention some examples, but what if I'm a local leader and I'm just trying to figure out how do I collect better data? How do I get information to the people who are making decisions? What suggestions do you have for people who are in that situation? And feel free to just jump in.
I mean, I dropped my email in the chat. You're welcome to hit me with a question if you have time. Your LDDs are great resources as well. And then there are a lot of online resources. I know, like, for example, broadbandhub.org has a good resource library and community where people can chat with their peers about what's being done well in other areas and get feedback.
Thanks, Curtis. And I know that Angela Seifer in the chat also dropped a link about there'll be more information about asset mapping tools and resources coming up on the National Digital Inclusion Alliance's website. Okay, we do have a question here. This comes from Paul Moon. What would you say to providers who do not offer emergency broadband benefit and or lifeline to their customers? What are effective ways to encourage providers to offer affordability programs to customers? Great, Roberto.
So this is, I was just helping state of Indiana manage their broadband programs. Many times what we found, and I'm not generalizing by any means, but just anecdotal, is that these smaller providers, there is a lot of compliance weight that's added to these ACP, to these affordability programs, and many of these providers may not have the bandwidth to do so. So I would approach them with that in mind and say, look, we see you're not participating. How can we help you participate in this? It may not be necessarily because they don't want to, it's because they feel it's too much of a burden for them. They may be a small shop or whatever the case may be, because the compliance and reporting is very, very tricky. It's the federal government. So I would just recommend you reach out to them, acknowledge, let them know, we know you're not participating. Tell me why, and how can we as a community help you participate so that we can all win at the end.
That's
yeah, and to
great.
build on that, I think reducing the customer acquisition component of that is something that folks can do. So helping connect, again, at the local level, you're gonna have a better idea of who target populations might be and how to reach them. So if you can help get people connected up and reduce that lift for those providers that you might want to see participate, that can be a good way to help them.
And Mac Pearsall is asking, how does the very well led and focused WNC digital access effort compare to other regions of the state? Is that a question? That might be a question for me, Mac. I would say the fact that we have a year from now, all 18 counties and the Qualla boundary in Western North Carolina will have digital inclusion plans in place and will be in the process of implementing those plans. Means that Western North Carolina may be one of the most digitally inclusive regions in the country, not just in the state. So truly the efforts that have been led by Land of Sky, Southwestern Commission, but now High Country, Western Piedmont, and Foothills Regional Councils is truly extraordinary. And all of the people on this call. I know that you have been a part of this effort for many years. And so it's pretty extraordinary to see what's happening. It's very exciting to be a part of it. Okay, thanks for that question. Sarah says that a question came to her that says, how will new maps at the federal level affect what the state is working on?
I think I can take that one. Yeah, it's really going to impact us in a big way as they get out of the census block methodology and they provide us more granular data. A lot of what we're doing right now is preparing our own framework data sets. North Carolina is a really data rich state. We work very well with a lot of the county local governments. We're aggregating addresses, we're aggregating parcel information, we're building out building footprints, we're doing all this work on all the pieces of the puzzle that then we can take the federal information and kind of validate things. So, but once we have that more granular data, it's really going to more specifically inform our grant programs like GREAT. So that will be used directly in that process. And just everything we will do will be improved upon because we know there's pockets that aren't represented. Right now, we're using those survey responses to kind of help fill those gaps, but we're not sure that it's making the rounds to every pocket in North Carolina. So with the more granular federal collection and data, we'll at least have a better path forward to get more specific focused funding out there.
Thanks, Ben. Well, we are almost out of time, and it looks like we have one more question here. It's a comment, I think. Deb says a big issue for many smaller ISPs, internet service providers, and the Affordable Connectivity Program participation is that 2 months they have to float the cost of subsidies while waiting for reimbursement from the federal government. So I think this gets back to the previous question about encouraging local ISPs to participate in those kinds of programs. Thanks, Deb. We appreciate that. In the final 3 minutes that we have, I think I'll just open it up to the panel for any last thoughts, words of wisdom, advice that you have for the group. So Aaron, I'm going to call on you first.
Yeah, so we know there's a mention earlier of the Digital Equity Act and the state digital equity plans that will be required as a part of that. The state of North Carolina is far ahead of a lot of other states and your region in particular. But we are really, really emphasizing to all the states that we work with to rely on their local communities, local coalitions, councils of government to pull information in. So both engagement information as well as mapping and other detailed information into those state digital equity plans. So you'll have an opportunity coming up here late summer, early fall to really provide a lot of support to the state broadband office and contribute the work that you've been doing locally to those state digital equity plans. So kind of the pre-work is to have that information ready, be ready when the state comes and is asking for input and asking for engagement and having, whether that's projects or other information you've collected from your local communities to contribute to that. I think that's a really key opportunity that'll be coming up here in a couple of months to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, that's a great point, Aaron. And it will likely be our Office of Digital Equity and Literacy that will be running that planning process. They will also have funds for counties that are ready to develop digital inclusion capacity building projects. And so over the next year, but continuously over the next 4 years. And so excited that Western North Carolina is going to be at a point where they can leverage those kinds of funds coming from the state, and then of course federal funds, which was talked a lot about. Okay, in 1 minute we have 3 more panelists. Roberto, any last words of wisdom for the group?
No, just keep up the great work you're doing, and this is an all hands on deck effort. And now with the digital equity component coming, it's very, very important. It's also very, very important to understand that it's a divide implies it can be crossed or bridged. And so I would frame it more of a continuum, right? Where there's going to be more challenges coming down the road. But if you have built that capacity, if it is in your awareness radar, I think that you should be fine. And it seems like you are. So just keep that in mind.
As Sarah had said earlier, build that ecosystem. So I think that fits nicely with what you said, Roberto. All right, Ben.
I'd just like to, I did put in the chat a link to the broadband resources, the mapping resources that we have available. And, I see our role as a state as just really getting the tools and the data out there to the people on the ground who are actually doing the real work. So if there's things that are missing, just please contact us, please communicate. We're always trying, we're a small shop, but we try to, be communicative and responsive. So if there's anything that we can do to help, please just let us know.
And Curtis, last words?
Yeah, one last shout out for that survey. Again, if I don't hear from you, I'm assuming that you will be extremely successful closing the digital divide in your community without my help. So let me know if that's not the case.
Right. Well, thank you all. I see that there might be some more questions coming in. So please join me and Aaron in the digital inclusion breakout session, and we can try to answer those. But I'll pass it off to Sarah and Dr. Cedarberg.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. Phenomenal job. And I hope the audience appreciates that these are 5 of the national leaders on this topic that we've been able to pull together with the help of Sarah and others. And Maggie did a great job as always. So thank you, panelists. Now, just to let you know, when we started these summits, it went from 10 to noon. And then the university was kind enough to provide a meal in which we could break into smaller groups to talk about the topics. And so we have continued that in this setting of switching now to 4 breakout groups. Now we're going to lose a number of people, I think, who have other responsibilities over the noon hour. And to those that are going to be dropping off, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continued communication with you. And we'll be sending you an email with links to the information, the slideshows, and we also put together some other documentation, such as UNCA's involvement in broadband, and Steg Newman and I put together our annual summary of observations about the broadband issue here in Western North Carolina. That also will be available. But at this point in the program, we're going to switch to 4 breakout groups and think of in fact, I'll buy you lunch today because it's so cheap, but we'll have 4 breakout groups, and the first is going to be on federal policy. And if you've signed up for that, Paul Desaw is staying with us and will lead that conversation. The second group is on digital inclusion, and Maggie and Aaron are back. And I hope that that group talks about Mac Pearsall's question that came in at the very end, where he asked, what are we missing here in the region? And I think that would be a critical issue for us. What are the things that we need to do that we're not doing? The third group is on funding, and that's going to be led by Sarah Thompson and George Collier. Sarah, if you don't know, was the Southwest Commission director. She joined Dogwood Trust and has been a phenomenal supporter of our efforts to deal with broadband here in the region. And Sarah, thanks for being willing to co-lead that conversation with George, who is from the state office. So the funding group will have a lot of good things to talk about. And then, of course, the best group is the one that I'm part of, and that's with Dr. Mark Hoyt to talk about future steps, both as organizationally, where do we go, but where does the technology and what does the future hold for Western North Carolina? So we hope that those of you that have signed up for that will stay with us and join in that conversation. We will then come back and have a summary of our groups and a summary of the overall event provided by Deborah Porto, and then a general wrap up. And I think we've scheduled about 40 minutes for this activity. So go back to the back of the room, grab a Diet Pepsi and a sandwich, whatever you have around your house or office or whatever, and we'll now split to the groups. Now, when we split to the groups, my understanding is you're going to be asked whether it's okay to video the group, and I hope you say yes, because we want to have this all available for online usage later. So with that, and I'm counting on Sarah jumping in if I forgot anything as we break to the groups, but I think this will be done automatically. If you didn't sign up for a group, you're going to be left in a queue, and Sarah and Kayla will assign you to a group as you wish, after the rest of us enter our group. So without further ado, I think somebody will push the magic button and we will advance to our groups.
Okay. Yeah, we were doing some exciting stuff there, so we'll have to find a way to continue that. But I just want to introduce myself quickly. I'm Deborah Porto, chair of the Haywood County Broadband Committee, and most of you have committees in your areas, but we have some great representation. We meet monthly. If anybody wants to learn more about what we're doing, we'd be happy to share that. And I just also want to take a call out to the rest of the members in the far Western that are in Swain, Leonard, and Julie, Macon, Jeff Lee, and in Jackson, Robin Starts. They do a fantastic job, somewhat herded by Russ. But we had some really great talk in the breakout session, and I was in the funding one. But we'd like to hear about 3 or 4 minutes from each of the leaders of the breakout sessions. And then we'll go through a little discussion about where we're going to go next, call to action, and have Bill wind us up. So if we could start with Paul from the federal policy session, could you give us 3 or 4 minutes wrap up of your session, please?
Sure. I don't know, Greg, do you want to do it? You were sort of chairing our breakout.
No, I'm happy to do it, Paul. If I was taking notes here. I figure since you were doing a lot of the talking, it would be hard. We talked a bit about how you prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, since the FCC has had problems with this, and it was noted that the states probably have to pay attention to this very carefully to make sure that there is no abuse in their processes. It was pointed out that there are going to be staffing issues on the part of the states and the federal government in order to perform all the tasks that there are in handing out the money. And in response to a question, there are 100% of all locations going to get served. Paul's opinion was that it's enough to do the job properly if the job is done properly, and that it's probably not going to be 100%. It's going to be 99% or 99.5%. There are some really intractable problems that are going to make 100% probably very difficult. And it was also pointed out there's going to have to be more coordination from FCC, from federal agencies who all have broadband funding authorities to make sure they're not duplicating funding. And now the states are going to have to add that role to make sure that money is used wisely. And that's basically the things that we talked about. There were some other issues, but.
Okay, that sounds great. I mean, such an important area, and that waste and fraud part always is a concern. Maggie or Aaron for digital inclusion, could you give us a summary of your session, please?
Yeah, we had a dynamic discussion. We kind of opened it up to the group to ask questions that came out of the session so far, and then did a little bit of dreaming about what could Western North Carolina do now in order to make sure that it continues to be digitally inclusive. We talked a lot about engaging trusted groups and getting the word out about the Affordable Connectivity Program. So whether those are libraries, schools, churches, it kind of depends on the community itself. We also talked about different resources. So the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has a coalition guidebook to help guide you on how to bring a group or a coalition together to develop digital inclusion planning. The North Carolina Broadband Infrastructure Office has a template that we also shared. And then finally, Aaron ended by sharing about the Digital Navigator Core that's through the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, but is placing a full-time digital navigator in 18 rural counties or tribal regions across the United States. And he shared some more information about how to apply to that. Aaron, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to uplift from that discussion.
That was a great summary. I think just one other discussion topic. There was some really robust conversation around competition and what competition means for improving access and affordability. And in light of some policy restraints on municipal broadband and certain options, what some other ways to kind of work around that might be, both in kind of practical strategies to encourage competition, and then also, just kind of encouraging among this group advocacy to encourage competition. And if there are policy barriers that can be removed to that, some strategy around how to develop some advocacy there.
Great summary. I think one of the things that caught my attention, you talked about working with trusted groups. So I think one of the issues that we certainly find in the Far West is the people who work on access aren't necessarily the best people to work on inclusion. They're two different skill sets. So I'm hoping these plans will address some of those issues. Great, thanks a lot. Let's hear now from the funding group, Sarah and George.
Sure, thanks, Deborah. We spent a little bit of time with George Collier from the state telling us about the great grant program, obviously of large interest to everyone on this call today, kind of going over some of the frequently asked questions about that program. I think one of the conversation topics of interest to the larger group that came out of our breakout is around the concerns with the RDOF awards that were made and the ineligibility for the great program that those awards created, largely with, I think, Charter in the Southwestern region winning a lot of that auction, and the uncertainty as to whether they will actually come in and serve those areas. And in the meantime, our inability to apply for grant funds as a result. So I think what came out of that, and Nathan Ramsey put this in the chat, and I agree with him on this, is a real need to advocate to our legislators on that RDOF, very specific RDOF issue. If they don't know about it, they can't help with it. George, Angie, was there anything else you'd like to add?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay.
Silence on the other end. I think George and Angie have to talk so often. They're very excited about not having to do the demos.
Thank you.
I think what's so interesting about the RDOF issue that many people have mentioned is I'm hoping that there will be a very creative solution to that sometimes in other intractable problems, we end up, going around it instead of through it, the way I think we're trying to do with that RDOF now. So that's exciting. Our fourth group was Future Steps. And I think, Mark, would you give a summary of that, please?
I'd be glad to. Bill does what he does best. He delegated and got me to stand in for him. So we had a great discussion. We actually started with a question that everybody was supposed to answer, and that's the one thing they'd like to have in place 5 years from now to help with connectivity, digital inclusion, all of this in order to help the region do better. And that's based on the fact that 6 years ago we started, and it was just get broadband to people, just get connectivity, just get the fiber into their homes. And now it's moved to, well, you got to get them access, and you got to help them understand how to use the devices and use that access. And now it's digital inclusion, and we're expanding the role of what this effort needs to do. And so that question was leading to, okay, so what do we do next? What's the next thing to happen? So the 4 takeaways that I took out of this, and then we'll let Bill pipe in and tell all the things I missed. Connectivity is still key, even though there's more money than any of us ever thought would be put towards this. There's a bunch of it coming. We're going to go from, I don't know what we're at, 96% access to 98.5%. There's still going to be a percentage that's not there. And one of the comments was insightful for all of us is, and then there are also rural areas that people want connectivity. When you're hiking in the forest, you don't have access in order to get good directions. You can't use the services. And I know some of us would like to get away from the technology while we're out hiking in the forest, but there's still a lot of reasons why you need some of that technology in rural locations other than someone's home. And so that was a good insight. There was kind of an agreement that we need to help find ways to enhance people's skills. So it's not just give them access so that they can take a class, it's so that they can figure out how to do the next skill in order to solve a problem they have, in order to start a business, in order to enhance their skills so they can move from one position they're at to the next level position, which leads to the third one is you need a personal driver. What is it that people are it's going to drive someone to want to pay the money, to want to connect, to want to go learn that skill or take that next level of education? The what's in it for me attitude, which drives everybody, right? Whatever that is, if I can't learn it, if I'm going to do this, great, I can watch videos, but what I really want to do is learn how to do something to enhance my ability to be successful, whatever that is. It could be better farming, it could be use data to improve your crop outcomes, it could be how to help your faith-based organization to attract more people, you name it, right? Whatever you're trying. And then the last one is to leverage the entire ecosystem. You have shown through today that there is an enormous ecosystem of people working together in order to try and solve this problem, bigger than it ever was when we started 6 years ago. When we started, it was municipal people, it was a few people that thought connectivity was important. It is now a huge group of folks that are trying to help their neighbors, that are trying to help their municipalities, that are trying to help their friends, that are doing everything. And that ecosystem, you have to leverage it. And we have to try and, through things like this, or organizations like this, try to get them to work together. Don't compete with each other, but collaborate and try and figure out how each of us can own a piece and do the piece that helps move us forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a great summary and sort of brought in pieces of all the different focus areas and the whole thing. So I'd like to sort of sum up and then turn it over to Cedarburg so he could finish this up for us. But this Broadband Summit has given us a lot of new connections, perspectives, ideas. Each one of these I've really enjoyed going to for broadband, and now we've added digital inclusion on this one. We'd like each to leave with an individual and a collective call to action to make universal broadband access and inclusion a reality sooner rather than later. We'd like each one of you to add to your professional and personal objectives 1 or 2 specific things that you can do to move the work of broadband access ahead. If you're a legislator or legislative staff, how can you align, change, adjust our local, state, and federal laws to face the reality of some of our issues on the ground? If you're an educator or a student, how can you learn more about broadband mapping, educate others on broadband technologies? If you're with a county, if you're a government, a state, federal employee, have you worked with your group to make financial and personnel commitments to make broadband access a reality? We've got so many resources from the Council of Governments. I'd really like to thank Land to Sky and Southwestern. They've been really critical to the work in Haywood County, and I know across the state. And the North Carolina Broadband Office, and we didn't see Keith, but shout out to Keith, are just absolutely fantastic with their assistance, their response, their sensitivity. But there are also many, many untapped community members with technical, managerial, communication, community organizing skills that we're finding useful and that can be organized into your committees. So we're hoping to send you off enthusiastic about the new world. And I'd like to call on Bill to close us out.
And thank you, Deborah, for your personal engagement in this. Those of you that don't know, she's been an incredibly positive force in Haywood County and is contributing just as a citizen to helping the county. So thank you for what you have accomplished in that. Now, my job is to do a little wrap up. First of all, I want to comment that Keith Conover didn't win that poll results. And I think that must have been skewed, because when I saw his name pop up in that survey question, I just knew Keith was going to walk away and win that competition. So you may want to look at that, Sarah. But my job is to say thanks to everybody that has been involved with this project over 6 years, and we made great strides. And before I officially thank people, there's one person that has really been particularly helpful, and that's Stag Newman. Stag is a retired FCC technologist. In a little paper that he and I have written about our observations about broadband, I mentioned that Stag is one of the intellectual leaders of this whole project, at least regionally. Stag, are you still on? Do you want to add one last comment?
Am I off mute? I think I am.
You are.
Okay. Yeah, I just, thanks to everybody. And I guess 2 real quick observations. One is, I think we in Western North Carolina really have to roll up our sleeves to solve our problem, because the state official and FCC official numbers probably understate by 90% the number of unserved, that we probably have 10 times more than numbers, and our cost is much higher. So I think the challenge is ahead of us. We've got the resources to do it. Hopefully there's more than enough money to go around. And then I think what came out so clearly today is then the challenge is the digital inclusion. If we get the infrastructure built, we've got to get everybody using it. So lots of work for those of us, particularly those of you who have far more expertise than I do in digital inclusion. Thanks to Bill and everybody for putting this together.
All right, thank you, Stag. And thanks to Sarah Nichols, who continued to do a phenomenal job at Land of Sky and on this project. Working with her is Kayla Christina, who has helped with this technology. Students from UNCA, Kennedy Young, Wes Bryant, and Braden Ball, phenomenally helpful. Mark Zarnecki, who runs the website and is our digital navigator, lead advocate in all of this. Faculty member Sonia Diploma has been involved with us, and students from her class. And so thanks to everybody. And I don't have anything else to say than thank you for all you do for broadband, and we look forward to continue to work with you. So have a great day. And I just want to point out to Sarah that we're about on time. So thanks for everybody's good work.